Steve Sweeney, you are the international editor at London newspaper The Morning Star. Thank you for being my guest on Syriana analysis. It's a really pleasure to have you on my channel. You recently been in Ukraine and you made some controversial statements about the situation there that I think you will make some enemies after these statements. But first things first, where did you go in Ukraine? What did you see that is different from the mainstream narrative that made you make such statements, for example, about the neo-Nazis in Ukraine?
Well, I think that for the people that follow the situation in Ukraine in the West, and certainly in Britain, they're being given a false narrative of what's happening, and this is coordinated through the mainstream press. So you have operating in Ukraine, you have the BBC, you have CNN, you have Channel 4, Sky News, the Times, the Telegraph, the Guardian, etc., etc. So all of the major news outlets are there, ensconced within mainly in Lviv and Kiev, from where they're producing these reports. But they're trying. What they're doing is that they're creating an impression that there are no Nazis in Ukraine. I wrote an article about this for Al Mayadeen called "Hurrah for the Azov," which deconstructs what I called a 9-minute masterclass in fascism denial from the BBC by its reporter Ros Atkins, in which he even contradicted the BBC's own previous reporting on Azov and the other right-wing organisations, the fascist organisations there. This is very different. And once you get inside Ukraine, I was only in Lviv, which is in the western part of Ukraine, as your viewers will probably be very well aware. And if you read the news reports in these media outlets, that they say that Lviv is largely untouched by the war, and life goes on as normal. Except that's not really the case, because you can see the impact of the war all around you. As soon as you arrive in Lviv, not only the checkpoints, but the sandbags or whatever that are protecting things, the air raid sirens. But the most notable thing is that in amongst the ordinary people of Lviv, what you can see on the streets are people in military fatigues, people that are, I'll describe them as mercenaries. These are people that have used civilian transport networks to come into the country, that are going to sign up in the international forces that Zelensky put a call out for. I saw these on my coach. I travelled in from Poland, and I saw these people on my coach. Sat opposite me, for example, on the way in was a man. Now, we shouldn't judge by appearances, and I try my hardest not to, but there was a man with a tattoo of a gun on his face. And I think you can safely deduce what where his politics may lie. Now, I don't want to assume, but given the propensity for far right forces to be entering the country, not just since the wars began, but since 2014, it's become a haven. A global haven for the far right, the global far right, and white supremacist organisations. I think it was safe to surmise that he may be of that political persuasion. But the whole of Lviv is really I'm not talking about the ordinary citizens there, but it's awash with fascists and mercenaries, as I have to say, as is much of the country now. My experience was a particularly unpleasant one, because as a journalist, I thought, well, the stuff that's coming out of the mainstream media is I don't trust it, and with good reason, and with good historical reason not to. So I thought, well, as a journalist, it's my responsibility to get to the truth and to report the truth, and to try and take the mask that's being portrayed to the people of Britain. So I went in to try and find out for myself exactly what's going on. But there's another issue, is that the people that are trying to get close to the truth end up being threatened, and they're placed at risk themselves. So we look at, for example, Eva Bartlett, who is a Canadian journalist who's doing some tremendous reporting from the Donbass and from the the eastern part of Ukraine. And she's one of her reports, I think, that's really worth paying attention to is this claim that there were 9,000 people found in a mass grave. Right now, I'm a journalist. I've seen mass graves in many places. I've seen them in Iraq. I've seen mass graves in the Palestinian refugee camp in Shabra and Shatila, for example. So, these things you can see. There's plenty of evidence that will back up what you're seeing and what people are saying as well. I mean, it's you can't hide 9,000 bodies. It would be physically impossible. But Eva went to the scene and she said, well, there's nothing there. There's no evidence. And there is a graveyard and there are bodies, but there's maybe a few hundred. But again, also what the mainstream press refused to admit or refused to speculate on is, well, actually, who killed them? Because there's an assumption that 9,000 bodies were found in a mass grave. It must be the Russians that killed them. It's the same very recently with a report on the 200 bodies that were found in an apartment in Mariupol.
Yes.
The situation is now that the caveat Ukraine says is used to justify any kind of reporting, no matter how ridiculous or evidence-free. So this example, a one-day-old baby was killed and raped by Russian soldiers. Ukraine says. I mean,
a Ukrainian grandma shoot down a Russian drone with a cucumber jar.
Yeah. I mean, it makes for a nice story, but I mean, if I was to present this to my editor, for example, and say, look, I've got a story about a mass grave, he would ask the questions. Well, what evidence have you got? Who said it? Has it been independently verified? Do you have any photographic evidence? I mean, 200 bodies in an apartment block basement, and there's no photographic evidence of these bodies. There's no indication of when it took place or even who killed them. I mean, It would be spiked. Most news organizations in a time, in a different time, would spike a story like that and say, well, we can't run it. But so, then there's, as Eva, the closer to the truth that Eva gets, the more, she's now on a government kill list.
Yes, she's vilified.
Patrick Lancaster, there's exactly this, and she's terrified, and it's unsurprisingly so, because you look at the case of Anatoly Shary, who is a journalist and opposition political leader, who actually ironically helped get Zelensky elected. He was supportive of Zelensky initially, but obviously they've long since broken. But earlier this month he was arrested in Spain. Now, he fled the country, I think, in 2012 to I think Lithuania, and ended up in Spain. This is a European Union country. They keep talking about European Union being the bastion of freedom and democracy. Okay, I mean, I don't believe them, but they say it. And he was arrested in a sting operation jointly with the Spanish police, but also the SBU, the Ukrainian intelligence service. Now, this is a terrifying case, because what it means essentially is that those that are seeking safety and sanctuary, and have been forced to flee Ukraine in fear of their lives, are not safe. Anywhere they go, they can be hunted down by an intelligence service. This is an intelligence service that has been compared to Hitler's SS. I mean, they've assassinated their own peace negotiators. Charges of high treason, which is what Anatoly Shary faces, quite often met with a bullet. And the response to that actually has been pretty poor, because I wrote a story about this for the newspaper. The international press organizations, journalist organizations refused to comment. And and then normally they get back to me within sort of 20 minutes, half an hour, and they stonewalled me on this particular case. Now, I think that kind of says that says a lot. But so what happened to me in Ukraine was kind of not anywhere near on the scale of the threats that have been made to Eva or Patrick or other journalists and Anatoly, but I was told in no uncertain terms that I was a spy. I mean, this is standard kind of thing, and I was, in a way, I was semi-expecting it. But
Steve, this is a typical behavior, or let's say technique, by the NATO-backed side, especially on the media level. I want just to give you some examples, taking from what you said. You mentioned, for example, the uniform guys and the tattoos on their hands in Ukraine. I was in Turkey in September 2014. When ISIS was occupying almost half the country in Syria. I attended a conference there, and I was with another Lebanese woman, and we were in a hotel, and there were 3 Libyan men. Each of these men were injured from somewhere. So one of them was in the belly, one without an eye, the other one is hand amputated. And they were very, like, you can see this black spot on their forehead. They say, like, because of they pray so much. It was a very clear indication that these 3 guys were in Istanbul for medical treatment. They were from ISIS, and they were living they found a safe haven in, let's say, in Turkey, right? And all these tens of thousands of multinational jihadists, they came through a NATO member state to Syria. So similarly, now we are seeing Ukraine is becoming a nest for the neo-Nazis, and not only the Ukrainians, but also all around Europe. And this is not, so therefore, it's not surprising how this, let's say, the liberal media, right? They're now trying to address the issue of the refugees from a sectarian, from a racist point of view, like saying, oh, the Ukrainians are different, they have blue eyes and they're blonde, they're not, they're from a civilized country. But this is all on purpose, because they want to provoke and encourage also the right-wing fascists in Europe, or the neo-Nazis, to go to Ukraine and fight for the Ukrainians, right? So the liberal media, it's not an accident. It is on purpose what they're doing. This is number one. Number two, when we talk about the neo-Nazi scene in Ukraine, I was in Ukraine, in Donetsk in 2015. And I swear, I thought that when the Russian side was explaining the neo-Nazi scene there, I thought this is an exaggeration. And I mean, any side in a war, of course, they exaggerate things for the public and for the broader international public, right? This is normal. All the sides do it. But when I was there, and we've seen how the Ukrainian army and the neo-Nazis are shelling Donetsk like non-stop, and everywhere and anywhere except some true squares, because they know there are international reporters and journalists there and some politicians, so they don't want to harm these people. And later we met a few families and mothers of, they lost their sons, and they were telling us that they were crucified by the neo-Nazis. And this is a similar criminal act that the ISIS terrorists did in Syria. So for me, the Azov battalion, what they did in Ukraine, and the ISIS, I am finding a hard time in finding distinctions among them. Of course, they have different ideologies, but in practice, underground, the terror that they are practicing on their foes, it is completely inhumane. And unfortunately, in both cases, we've seen it's either NATO is complicit with these terrorists, or they're supporting them directly or indirectly. The third point is, you mentioned that Eva is terrified and you're called a spy. My pictures in Germany were hanged in the streets. My picture, like 300 times in the streets, it's written over it in German, Spion, which means a spy. So there was an Islamist here. He thinks like I'm a spy for Assad. So there, he printed my picture and he's posting it in the streets. So, and unfortunately, the police is not doing enough. I received tens of death threats, and for them, if somebody do not act on the ground in harming you, they're not gonna take a precaution steps to protect you. Maybe sometimes they send, let's say, a police car under your apartment. That's not enough. I'm pretty sure that these Islamists are vile and they can inflict damage, and they want to kill me. It's because for them, what I'm doing is like I'm putting a mirror in front of their face. I'm not even making any exaggerations. I'm just showing what they say in Arabic on my channel, and what they claim that they are in front of the Western audience, which is 180-degree difference. They say we are democratic rebels, but they are sectarian, they are genocidal maniacs, and we know this from Syria. So of course, I'm also terrified by the Islamists. I'm also now terrified by the neo-Nazis, because probably during this influx of refugees, probably there are also neo-Nazi Ukrainians now in Berlin. If somebody finds you on Twitter or on YouTube, he would try to harm you. So we are not living in a safe environment, unfortunately, not protected as journalists in this regard. But one of the things that I wanted to discuss with you, like before the current war in 2022, especially in the era between 2014 and 2021, there was a war in Ukraine. But at the same time, the mainstream media was reporting about the neo-Nazi scene there because they were harming the LGBTQ community, they were harming the feminists, they were harming human rights activists, they were harming journalists, they attacked lots of gatherings, right? Liberal gatherings in Kiev, for example. And we've seen documentaries and reportages about this. What has changed in 2022 when the Nazis now became patriots, according to the mainstream media? And today I was reading the Times, and of course, I'm not going to read all the article because they want me to pay, and I would not pay even a cent to read their article, but this is the headline. The Azov battalion drops a neo-Nazi symbol from its uniforms that has helped perpetuate Russian propaganda about Ukraine being in the grip of white nationalism. What has changed in 2022, and to what extent these mainstream media in Britain and the United States can sink in their reporting to whitewash the neo-Nazis in Ukraine?
Well, I think, there's some very good points that you've raised there. I just wanted to touch on the comparison really between the jihadist organizations in Syria and the neo-Nazis in Ukraine, because I think that there's a definite link between the two. And the imperialist powers are using, I mean, Azov really are now the new moderate rebels. If you remember, that was the term that they used to describe the myriad of groups that are operating in Syria. These are groups that were funded by the United States. They were Operation Timber Sycamore. Was a covert CIA program which gave, I think, $1 billion. It was the biggest operation in the CIA's history. They gave $1 billion to these organizations. This was, channeled through rat lines. They were given, arms and training and support. Also, Turkey was, colluding in this very heavily. I was down at the border in a town called Akçakale, which was, I went down a road called the Jihadi Highway, in which, they were jihadists were crossing back into Akçakale from Raqqa, from Tel Abyad, and they were using the hospitals there to patch up their war wounds. They were having R&R in the hotels and the restaurants there before going back out onto the battlefield. But of course, Turkey is absolutely complicit in the support of jihadists in the area. Of course, this couldn't have happened without the explicit support of the United States and the imperialist powers. I mean, this is very clear that Turkey is not acting as an independent force. Really, it's in hock to the United States, and it does whatever the imperialist powers and NATO tells it to. So we saw that situation in Syria, which is still ongoing. The two ISIS leaders, by the way, that were killed very recently. Again, I've written about this for Al Mayadeen. It's very clear that they were both CIA assets. To me, it's very clear anyway. I mean, they were both held in Camp Bucca in Iraq, which was under the control of the CIA. You can read their interrogation notes actually of the pair of them. So I mean, is it credible to suggest that these two people could have left after years in their prison, a CIA operated prison, have left and made their way back into Syria and risen to the top of ISIS without being tracked or monitored or under the surveillance of the United States? Of course not. And of course, it's no coincidence that they were both assassinated close to the Turkish border, in a US hit operation. So
in a moderate rebel held area.
Yeah, sorry, yes, yeah, of course, yeah, in moderate held area. I mean, HTS, they were working with the US. The US has been holding talks with them for a long, long time, and it was them that gave the coordinates away and helped them plan those assassinations. So what you're seeing in Syria really was a kind of a pre-run for what's happening now in Ukraine, where, like you quite rightly said, the war didn't start in February 2022. There's been a war in Ukraine for 8 years, largely waged by the neo-Nazi forces in the Donbass region. I've been reporting on this, since then. But this, there's kind of a collective amnesia that period never happened. That the attack on the trade union house in Odessa, and the burning alive of of the trade unionists and others that had barricaded themselves in that building to escape the neo-Nazis, that didn't happen. And they kind of forget the Euromaidan, or the Maidan coup, which was a coup against democratically elected government and a replacement with a Washington friendly administration there. So you kind of saw the seeds of it there. But now I think we have to get to the crux of what this is about. And this is about the US is weakened. It fears the loss of the dollar as the world currency, and if it loses that, then, because we already started before the war seeing the shift away from that, with particularly in like Saudi Arabia and other countries are looking to move away from the dollar, and it loses its control or ability to manipulate world markets. So it needs to defend. This is a war that's been waged in defense of a unipolar world, and behind Russia, this is I'm assuming we're all on board. I mean, this is, without any shadow of a doubt, a proxy war. This is a NATO and US proxy war against Russia, but also not just Russia, but behind Russia, China as well. And as the moderate rebels that were used to force regime change, or attempt to force regime change in Syria, now we're seeing the exact same, but the Azov battalion are now being used as NATO's battering ram, and to hell with the consequences, to hell with the blowback. I mean, this is, Azov must be in dreamland, in a way, because they have the two things that they've craved the most, and they've been gifted them by the West: credibility and weapons. There's millions or billions of dollars of weapons, hardcore weapons, that have been placed in the hands of neo-Nazis. Now, what happens when the war ends? When things, you're going to have a very heavily armed fascist force.
You're asking conspiracy questions, my friends, because we are on the same page on this. I think for the political elites in the West, particularly, whatever happens after the war is they think they can contain it. It is, for example, when they supported the jihadists in Syria, and they knew some of them are coming among the refugees to Europe, for them, this blowback is, they can contain it, because in Syria, 500,000 people died. How many Europeans died? A few hundred Europeans during the past 10 or 2 decades. So for them, this is collateral damage, right? And the same thing with the Azov now. But Azov, I think it will be more dangerous, because geographically speaking, when you're giving Stinger missiles, Iglas, and lots of sophisticated weaponry to the Azov, and these guys, when they feel they're losing, I suspect that they will start selling their weapons, just like the Free Syrian Army in Syria. When they received all the weapons from the CIA, they sold it to ISIS or to al-Nusra or to other groups. So the Azov, and what makes them, what's the barrier or the obstacle for them not to sell these weapons in the Polish black market in the future, and later from the Polish market to other European markets? And this makes me ask, is the airspace in the European Union safe? Because with these weapons that they supplied, for example, to the so-called rebels in Syria, they tried to gun down several civil airplanes in Aleppo and in Damascus. So I think similar incidents possible can happen in Europe as well. But as I mentioned, for the moment, it's a very death or life battle for the European and for the Western elites, and they're investing so much. They want to defeat Russia. I think it's impossible to defeat Russia, but they can really harm Russia in the Ukraine scene by a very long, let's say, war of attrition, that they managed to do in Afghanistan, although the geography is different in Ukraine. And at the same time, I think Russia this time was prepared for the sanction regime scenario. And at the beginning, I thought the time is in favor of the United States. And now I'm like seeing time is in favor of Russia because of the harm the economies in Europe and the United States are suffering because of these unilateral coercive measures, the sanctions, and two, cutting the oil. And today, or on Monday, the European Union decided to cut around 90% of oil imports from Russia by the end of 2022. So with halting nuclear and coal energies, for example, in Germany, and now reducing the Russian oil import to the minimum levels, how will Germany's industry sector survive? And do you also share the sentiments with me that there is an unspoken NATO plot to weaken and deindustrialize Germany? And for that, one of the followers on my Twitter, he wrote, he said, that's the plan, weakening Europe, especially Germany and France. America wants to crush European economy and military power on the way to the unipolar world.
I think there's a lot in that actually, and I was going to come on to this because whereas in Syria the sanctions that are essentially a form of economic warfare designed to starve a people into submission, but they're backfiring. Look at the you look at the Bank of Russia and the current account. The surplus, which is export minus import, is $96 billion for between January and April. That's it's an increase of 4 times on the previous year. So the sanctions really, I mean, if you look at goods and services, it's 106 million, which is 3 times over the for the increase over the same period the previous year. Now, if you compare that to what's happening in Europe, as you said, the German economy today posted a record 7.9% inflation rate, which is the highest since the 1973 oil crisis. And it's predicted that it's going to rise to 10%. 500,000 jobs are going to be potentially lost as a cut off of Russian gas and oil. In Italy, you're seeing again the same 7% inflation, record levels. It's the highest it's been for decades. And again, they're saying 500,000 job losses. But things are so desperate there that the Prime Minister Mario Draghi is considering a state of emergency. The country is sliding into desperate recession. Military spending again is on the increase. Germany, as we know, amended its constitution recently to allow for this new defence. Special defence budget of whatever that was, 100 million euros a year on top of the current defence spending. And Italy's being again driven to increase its spending to meet this 2% of GDP target of NATO. Now in Italy, they went on strike. There was a general strike because workers are quite rightly angry. They're saying, under the slogan, lower your guns, raise our wages. So you're seeing this. So I agree with you. I think that there is this plan to kind of assert US hegemony in Europe, and obviously the key to that is destroying the German economy, because Germany is Europe's economic powerhouse. It traditionally has been for a long time, but also it's with Olaf Scholz as chancellor, I don't think much has particularly changed. He seems for everything that he says, he will always bend to the NATO and the imperialist powers. That's what social democracy does and the role it's traditionally played. So there's no great surprise, but there is at least some resistance in that. Germany sometimes will try and stick a minor spoke in the works. Hungary, Viktor Orban again has he's kind of stuck to his guns over a Russian oil ban. I mean, this idea that a ban on Russian oil or opposition to Russia and support of sanctions on Russia is a universal thing is also completely false. There is no the majority of the international community oppose that. It's just that when the US and the West talk about the international community, what they mean is,
they don't only mention the international community now. They say the entire world is sanctioning Russia.
Yeah, which of course is is completely untrue. But I mean, we've seen the kind of the response to that, though. Those that are ploughing an independent foreign policy. Look at Pakistan, for example, where Imran Khan opposed the sanctions on Russia, and he was opposed in a US-backed coup.
Yes.
Um, that was the price that he paid, and there were alleged plots to kill him. So I agree. I think that you're right, but I don't think it's going to be as necessarily as easy as the US thinks it is. The Russian economy is proving to be pretty resilient. It's the other thing is that despite what you hear in the Western press, they've done a slight U-turn now. Ukraine isn't winning the war. Ukraine is not, is far from winning the war. Russia is achieving all of its objectives, in the war, and you're seeing a slight change in tone now from the Western press, who acknowledge actually Russia is making advances in the east, and it is that things aren't quite. I mean, it always makes me laugh really when they say Ukraine's winning the war. Okay, so if Ukraine's winning the war, why have you just passed a $40 billion aid package in the US Congress, while your people are suffering with rising inflation and job losses and struggling to put food on the table? I mean, it's why is Zelensky going to the World Economic Forum in Davos with his cap in his hand, begging for money and demanding more weapons? I mean,
he's talking to everyone now, even to university graduates. And to be honest, I have complete sympathy with the Ukrainian people, because I believe they are victim of this proxy war between NATO and Russia. But it was NATO who was pushing and pushing and pushing and provoking Russia by its expansion in Eastern Europe. And then Zelensky, he sent tens of thousands of his soldiers on the borders again with Donetsk in order to reconquer it. So for Russia, from their perspective, this was necessary. However, we are one of the people, at least in the past 10 years, when the war erupted in Syria, and then we learned how to map, right? How to read maps and how to map the territories under the control of the government, of the rebels, ISIS, etc. And now it's the same in Ukraine, and we learned at least the alphabet of geography. And when someone says Ukraine is winning, and I'm checking the map, it's like I don't know what do they mean by winning, because because soon Ukraine will turn into an inland. They will lose all the access to the Azov Sea, and they will lose to the Black Sea, and therefore they will lose the access also to the Mediterranean, because through these seas you can also access to the Mediterranean. And by doing so, Russia is depriving Ukraine of its geopolitical importance, which is why NATO and Russia are fighting over Ukraine, right? So I hope that there would be a security agreement between NATO and Russia, and there would be a peace established in Ukraine, because we lived 10 years of war in Syria, and we don't wish the same for anyone. But at the same time, I think the world will be in a better place without these radical jihadists, and also without the neo-Nazis.
Yeah, I agree. And you said that this is going to be a war of attrition, and the US, I think that's they've even declared now that they want to stretch this out to weaken Russia, and this is why they're opposing a peace deal. I mean, Zelensky, I think, and would have signed a peace deal, but both Britain, Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister, in his visit there, and the United States have made sure that this hasn't happened. And of course, we had a month or so ago that the 8 largest arms companies,
yes,
BAE Systems, Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, etc., were invited into the Pentagon, and they were told to make more arms, to produce more arms. So this is really about propping up the industrial military complex. I mean, it's incredibly clear. And I think what is clear is there was a road to peace and there was a road to war. The road to peace was mapped out already. It was mapped out in the Minsk Accords.
Exactly.
Too. It was mapped out by Russia in numerous diplomatic notes that they sent outlining their security concerns that America that America chose to ignore. So the road to peace was there, and unfortunately, for the people of Ukraine and the people, ordinary people across the world, the Americans, NATO, and the imperialist powers chose the path to war.
I've been your host, Kevin Almacen of Syriana Analysis. If you like my reporting, please subscribe and hit the like button, as it really helps me with the algorithm of YouTube. And if you want to support my work, please become a patron. Link in the description below, and see you next time.